Welcome back to Showing Up. In case you missed the episode title, let me give you a quick disclaimer. We are going to be talking a lot about sex. We are going to admit that people have sex, that we've had sex, and that sex is an important part of a relationship. If that's a triggering subject for you, and I know for many people it is, feel free to skip this episode. Okay, here we go. Today on the Showing Up podcast, we have Rebekah LaRobardiere. She is a renowned sex coach working in Redding, California, but available all across the country. Hi, Rebekah.
Hi.
We want to start by giving Rebekah a chance to give us a little bit of context about what is it that you do, and then we'll get into why in the world are you doing this. So if you could start by giving us a little context for your work. What is a sex coach?
So a sex coach deals with emotional, relational, and sexual health and wholeness.
Emotional, relational, and what was the other one?
Sexual.
Oh, and sexual. Health and wholeness. What does that mean?
When I first start seeing somebody, they may come to me and say, hey, I'm having trouble with my sex life. Rarely does it have anything to do with technique. It has to do with everything surrounding it. The relational aspect, the connection aspect, the potentially trauma aspect. There's all these other things that play into why people struggle with their sex life.
So who comes and finds you? Who wants to hire a sex coach?
So I have quite a few moms that want to come after having children, those that have lost the desire for their spouse because they become more roommates than lovers, and life just keeps going and you forget to keep the relationship intentional like you did during dating and engagement. And so then it's boring. They've hurt me, I've hurt them, you become disconnected, and then you don't want to have sex, and so there's an issue. And then I have others that sex may not be the issue, but the relationship is the issue, or the communication is the issue, or confidence is an issue. Women especially are the ones that I see come in and they can crush it in every area of their life except their bedroom. They become a different person. They lose their confidence, their self-esteem. And so a lot of what I do is help women remember who they are and that they are worth loving well and loving themselves well.
Kirk, in your executive consultant, I mean, I'm sure it's taken on different titles throughout the years. I mean, you were suggested to me as a life coach. I do relationship coaching. There's all sort of the back door or front door, depending on how you look at it, way that we get in. And it seems like a lot of the work is similar, right? But the door that we enter is specific usually to some passion in our life or some area of kind of authority or experience. So what about the sexual aspect of it, Rebekah, for you, made you decide to call yourself a sexual sex coach instead of a emotional wellness, wholeness coach who specializes? What about that got you attracted to that particular title?
Because sex is fun.
There you go. And thus concludes our episode for today on the Showing Up podcast.
I chose to be a sex coach because I always knew when to work with couples, and I love to see couples thrive. And most couples, either their 2 points of contention are either finances or sex, and I don't want to deal with finances. So let's deal with sex because it's a lot more interesting and fun. It kind of got spurred on after Sam and I got married, because you grow up in the church and the church gives you this idea of what it should be. And sex is bad until you get married, and then it's supposed to be great. And if you do everything right, it's going to be like 4th of July. And it doesn't always happen that way. And so those are the other clients that I get, that they believed a lie that people fed them, much like most of us, and trying to reshift or broaden their perspective of what sex is. It's not just for men, it is for women too. And a lot of women growing up in the church, and men for that matter, believe that sex is for the husband and not the wife. And so you go into marriage believing that. And so a lot of women don't know what they want. That becomes an issue when the husband wants to know how to please a wife, and she doesn't know that that's an option.
Wow. That might be a fun place to start, is the lies or the myths about sex that you have to unwind. What are the top things that you're unwinding in people's lives?
Sex is for men, that it's for the husband or for the man, and it is a duty. To be a good wife, you have to give your husband sex.
Wow. That is an old one too, isn't it? That one's been around
so long.
Do you run into other ones that you have to unwind for people?
You get that sex is not talked about. It's for procreation. You still get that one, which I was kind of surprised.
That's what it's. That's all it's
what
for.
It's for. It's not for pleasure, and it's not for fun. It is for procreation. You have women that have trauma, and so it's shameful. And if things happened before they were married and it was pleasurable, it's still associated with sinning or bad. Women aren't sure how to cross that bridge of it is good here too, but they're triggered by the sensations, the feelings, the thoughts. And so they're taken back and try to shut it down as bad still in marriage, because the association is not a good one.
Yeah. Even I imagine in the kind of Christian upbringing, sin context of premarital sex. What about kind of, have you worked with anyone who pre-marriage, feels all this attraction and all this stuff, and then after marriage, given the nature of desire and sort of like, oh, we have this whenever, all of a sudden just says boom, and kind of where did that go? I couldn't keep my hands off you then as soon as marriage happens.
That's a big one. I get that often. Some of it is belief system of, it's all bad. And so you're messing around choosing to do something bad, but because you've put it in the bad category, your brain is still wired for it to be bad, and you can't just flip the switch. They have to rewire and rework their thought patterns to match with what they actually want to believe.
How do you I don't know why I can't ask this question right. But what does it look like to walk where do you start in this journey? So you have people come in and they've got these ideas. Let's say they believe sex is for men, or sex is bad, that kind of stuff for whatever reasons. Where do you start? What do you do if you have those ideas floating around in your head?
I normally ask them right off the bat, what do you want? And what do you want to believe? What's your goal? Because their head and heart aren't lining up. They know it's supposed to be for both. They know, they've heard, they've seen, they have this idea that it could be for them, just not sure how to shift it. And so I have them articulate and describe what they want. And some...
Are they able to do that?
Well, that's normally their first bit of homework. Like, go home.
Yeah, figure that out.
Go home and figure out what you want and what your goal is. And then every decision we make in the time that they see me is for that goal. And I'll encourage them to try this. And if it doesn't work, it's still a win, because it's honing in on what actually works for them as an individual.
Do you have, this is a totally generalized question. Do you have, some people might ask, well, what is a healthy sex life look like? I know it's silly to even go down to like there's no general, there's no kind of thing, but is there any kind of prescriptive within some kind of a barrier here? Just talk about that however you want, because I'm sure there's kind of like what does a healthy sex look like?
The goal is that they feel connected. The ultimate goal in a healthy sex life, depending on what they're going for. If they're just going for fun, you've got that. If you're looking for intimacy and where you actually have a deeper level of connection, it depends on what they want. Some just want sex. Some just want fun. And some want intimacy, which would take them all. To have healthy, there is no one size fits all. And when I'm speaking to women or groups of women, I tell them it's like a bra. Like for a healthy woman, you have to wear the right size to actually have it fit. It's different for everyone. It's where are you and how are you showing up? And for women, it's their confidence. And a lot of times they'll ask, how do I be sexy? I'm just awkward. And I tell them that is me. I am an awkward sexy, because you get to choose what your sexy looks like. You don't have to look like someone else, but if you can own it and rock it, it's a win.
So I heard you say, connection is the goal. Is that what you said? So let me give you for example. So if I knew some friends of mine, if I had friends and I knew a couple who would say, we're totally connected. We enjoy our marriage and stuff. But let's say this is the person who comes to you. We probably have sex like once every other month, but we are totally connected. And I just want to ask you, is that okay?
And my response would be, so why are you asking me? Because I will not tell people what to do, because I won't be their scapegoat. If they are perfectly happy and we're connected and that's all I want, and it's true, fine. You do you.
So it's kind of like, what if they say, well, I'm here because this is way less than what many people would say is a healthy sex life. And so I'm a little concerned about that. But as far as I know, I'm sure this would lead to just more and more questions. That I'm kind of getting back to this sort of prescriptive question and like connected. How important to connection is sex, and how viable, and is there other ways around it in marriage and that kind of thing?
So are you suggesting that if people aren't having sex, maybe even very often, that might be indicative of a lack of connection, just by definition?
Is sex also a thermometer as well as a barometer for steaminess? Yeah.
Part of my thinking is we choose to get married because we love the person and because we want to have sex with them. And so if we quit having sex with them when at one time we wanted to have sex with them constantly, there's a disconnect. Something has shifted. And what is that something? Because when you first get married and you're having sex as often as you can, and then you throw some children in, you throw in new jobs, you bought a house, and your lives are going opposite directions, and you don't make time for it anymore. Why? Is it boring? It could be just boring. And if that's the case, you can make it more interesting if you choose to.
Okay, 2 quick questions. Have you ever used, Rebekah, a "that's what she said" joke in any of your coaching?
Oh, yeah.
Ever? I love that. I imagine there has to be so much space for humor in sex coaching, right? Also, probably because a lot of people are uncomfortable, and humor is a great little release valve. Okay, secondly, you can answer this however feels prudent, but how common or what is the sort of female non-orgasm story? Like you mentioned, it's boring, or it's, and I know, I've talked to my wife and her friends, a lot of them talk about not orgasming in a marriage is is a real thing. And I would think that would be very boring if that were the case. And given the way men and women are made, it seems to be
it's extremely common. I would say the majority of the time that women have sex, unless, I would say the majority, women don't orgasm. It takes a lot more intentionality. And women can also have multiple and long ones, unlike men, but we're trained to believe that ours should look like just spike and be done like a man's. And because the men are the ones that originally did sex education, that's what they knew and that's what they taught. And so it's just blanket across the board. Women don't, because it takes them longer to be ready. When that's the case, I will encourage women to figure out what they want. Are you fine with not orgasming? Because it still can feel good. Or if they come see me, it's because they're both willing to pay to come see me. And so the husbands are on board. More often than not, the husbands want to please their wives. They just don't know how. And so at that point, you give techniques, you give homework where they work together and go from there. Did that answer the question?
Yes, it did. I heard you saying that's the majority of women's probably experience as far as what you've seen. That seems to be consistent with what I've heard from.
It also fits in the narrative that sex is for men. If that's the primary, if that's the biggest myth, does that myth cut across age demographics, religious backgrounds?
It's across the board.
That's a cultural across the board. Where did that? Why is that still a thing? I know where it came from. That's obvious, but why is that still a thing?
Well, I have a theory.
Yeah, go for it. Because I don't know. You think that would be dying?
You would
at this point,
but a lot of it is still based from the church, and they don't talk about it, and it's shameful. If you can scare women to not have sex before marriage, then you are, keeping everyone pure. But if you explore sexuality outside of marriage, then, you could get pregnant, or because it is understood that guys will go sow their wild oats. No one knows. Really, they don't see any difference in the man, but the woman will get pregnant, and then it's shameful. If there was no visible sign that you had sex, my guess would be it wouldn't be as big of a deal, because as long as I don't have to see it, I can ignore it.
It's interesting, the purity code, which is really a moral code that gets attached to sex, and how that plays out inside religious cultures and what that's done to sex. And then as a result of that, this idea that we just don't talk about it. That was my experience growing up. It was only talked about in the context of don't. I don't remember it hardly ever being talked about in the context of do. And then the only place that was ever offered was in school, sex ed, little whatever module, 2 weeks of this. But then then the churches were all freaking out. All the parents had, and then certain kids would get pulled out and I'm like, I look back on that now and what a weird reality that I guess and probably still is. We just don't talk about it. But the truth is, I haven't spent a ton of time talking about it with my boys. It comes up for something that is the number one or two thing that they're going to fight with their spouse about, money or sex. You'd think I'd be talking about it more, but that's just not modeled. It doesn't come up. And then there's this whole taboos around it. And I still am baffled. No, I'm not baffled. That's not the right word. I'm trying to figure out it's just normal to not talk about it. And so when I remember when I first found out you were a sex coach, right? Just that was like the most outlandish, crazy, but I had to like adult myself and go, no, that's totally makes sense. That's a good thing. Like embrace this. This is good. But something in me was still like, you can't do that. Which I don't actually believe at all. But yet that was and I remember we were at a soup and wine when, and the whole room just sort of orbited around that conversation for like 20 minutes. We just don't talk about it. Why do we still not talk about it?
Because it's personal and vulnerable, because everyone wants to believe that they're good. And what if we're not?
Good at sex or good as an inherent human being?
But no one knows except your spouse or people that you've been with. And so it's this vulnerable, private, it is a private thing. And it is sacred, but it's also fun and it's natural. It's happening. And we are all here because someone had sex.
Yeah. So there's been at least about 7 billion sexual encounters. At least. You guys can reveal as much as you want. Do you in your limited conversations that you've had, Kirk, with your children, I don't know how old your children are, Rebekah, is the conversation wait until you're married to have sex? Is the generalization around it? Is that your prescription?
I don't know that I've ever said that out loud, like as a mandate or an expectation. Mm-hmm. Partly because that idea, well, this is one of the places I'm actually pretty stuck in terms of practical life. 150 years ago, it would have been common to get married in your teens,
right?
Young teens. At some point along the way, we started pushing that out because lifespans increased. People are in school longer. People get married a little bit later. We're wealthier as a general, so we're not trying to have as many kids and all that kind of stuff. And so a lot has changed. So I didn't get married until I was 24. That's a big difference between 24 and 14.
Right.
But now people aren't getting married until their late 20s, early 30s. And so the idea of not having sex before you get married has a practical implication for men of you will not be sexually active during your sexual prime. Mm-hmm. That seems biologically rude at best, and impractical in some ways. And I don't know what to make of that idea. And that's the world that my boys are actively engaged in.
I'd be curious, Rebekah, what is that a conversation that you've broached with your kids? I don't know their ages.
They're 9, 10, and 11. And we have had the sex talk with all of them, and it is an open conversation here. Like, they'll bring it up at the dinner table, ask questions, and it just is. And partially because of what I do, like, they'll tell their teachers or their classmates, my mom's a sex coach, and they're like, there's no such thing. Yes, there is.
She's our mom. She exists.
So yes, it's an open conversation. We have encouraged them. Well, we've told them that sex is not bad. Sex is good. And God designed it as a gift. And the gift is best if you wait till marriage. But it doesn't make it bad if you are doing it because you love somebody or believe you love somebody before then. So that's kind of where we have it, because I would love for my children to wait, because there's a lot of baggage that can come along with sleeping with other people. And when you are able to give it to somebody, and only that one person, it does make it that much more special. Potentially a lot more work.
Yeah, but I can... Right, or way more rude biologically, as Kirk puts it, which totally is understandable. But I see where that line becomes very thin in being able to have this conversation, not shamefully, and say, this would be my hope for you if I could. If this doesn't end up being the case, it's not a mistake, irredeemable kind of thing. But this still is what I'm trying to walk you towards as my children. And I imagine what I know, even from my wife and I, after 2.5 years, I still have this feeling sometimes after having sex, like we just got away with another one, kind of like,
yeah.
Oh, we did it. We did the thing. And that is totally upbringing, conditioning, like, hold off, don't do it. And it's not all bad, but there is some in there that's like, what in the, I'm a 37-year-old man now who's like feeling like it's such a weird line, but even the privacy aspect of it, if you're sharing a house or in your apartments or whatever, people hearing you, is that taboo? Should I be ashamed of that? But what is a healthy sense of it's sacred and it's personal,
Don't be ashamed of it.
Yeah.
One of the things that introduced modern privacy was when the fireplace in a home was able to move to the wall and go up a chimney. So when you could contain smoke and stick it over on the wall and put it up through a chimney, you could start building rooms in a house. That created rooms and doors, which created privacy. And then things escalate from there in terms of our concepts of privacy. And that was about 400 years ago, which means prior to that, everybody slept out on the floor in the middle of a space together. And then I'm like, oh, right. And they were still having kids.
Yeah.
And so I've never actually looked at the history of sex related to this question, but I was like, oh, this whole sense of behind closed doors, private, can't even hear, right? Don't even want people to hear you having sex. That's a new modern conceptualization that is a function of a piece of technology called a chimney. I can't imagine having all my kids laying around and having sex in the middle of our living room.
Please just do it for a second. Just do it for a second and tell me what you're feeling.
Awkward, like impossible, like not able. Like, are you turned on? Not even a little bit. Nope.
Not even close.
Not even a little bit.
Yeah.
So there,
But what is it? So you're talking about that. I'm putting myself in this position. I've gone on retreat Airbnbs with other couples and friends and stuff, and I can put myself in that position right now. I think about hearing them, and it like automatically reverts me back to if I'm there with my wife, kind of look at each other, giggling. Like, what is that thing that's still? I'd be curious. You guys who've been at it a little longer than I have. Like, what is your feeling around the hearing someone having sex, or like the idea, is there that, when you mentioned awkward, Kirk, but I'm just saying for me, I guess I'll say is there still is this, I oscillate between young boy response to sex, which is like that kind of thing, and then like trying to adult it and be like, yep, it's totally normal, and I kind of back and forth between the two.
For me, I was really unaware of how I felt about sex. I didn't question it. I had my worldview on it, and I didn't question that until my early 40s. But I didn't know this idea of it being bad, or these lines that Becca's talking about, as anything other than just normal. I didn't question it until I was in seminary, and the concept of sex as an act of worship was introduced. Why do we call marriage? Why is marriage in some traditions a sacrament? Why is the Bible so full of sexual metaphor in various places? And what does that? What do we take from that theologically? And one of the theological implications is the idea that sex is an act of worship or a means of grace. And when that was first said to me, I had no box in my brain for that idea. And that revealed to me just how dirty or bad or shameful or I felt about it. It was not sacred. It really revealed something to me. I still think I have a lot of room to grow, which is why I'm probably not talking about it effectively with my boys, because I still don't. Here I'm fumbling all over words even in this, right? I don't know how to reconcile the experiences I've had growing up in a purity culture, religious environment that made it all bad, and also never talked about it. And then said, like what Becca was saying, and then said, once you're inside of marriage, like, good luck with that. It still like doesn't come up. So I still feel that sense of like private. It's not that it's private, it's hidden, right? It's a hidden act, but everyone's doing it and no one's talking about it.
Yeah.
It's just a weird reality. The more I've thought about it over the last decade, it's a mess.
I wanted to quickly go back and ask Rebekah, what percentage do you see couples, and how many percentages do you just see women? And are there any men who you counsel by yourself or coach by yourself?
I do. Most of my clients are women. I have some couples, and sometimes the women will bring their husband in every so often. So then I'm helping him navigate instead of the wife going and say, you need to do this, which is never beneficial. And so I'll do it that way. And I have had a couple male clients.
Okay. And so kind of jumping off of what Kirk was just talking about, I'm curious if, the enjoyment part of it, has it ever been almost sort of, I keep using this word prescription. That's funny. But like it just, the connection aspect of sex is good in and of itself. So almost like in the meantime, out of principle, until maybe our mind or emotional things catch up, there's almost this sort of like homework, or sort of like, this is as good a part of life as exercises, as eating well, as like connecting verbally and emotionally.
So it depends on what they're actually coming for. And sometimes I will say, okay, I want you to just go home and have sex. It's not fake it till you make it at all. But a lot of times you don't realize you want it. And when someone asks, because a lot of the women that I see don't always initiate. It's not on their grid because you have children. And if physical touch is not high on your priority list, then it's gone by the time your husband comes home from work. And so it's not always the front of the wife's mind or the woman's mind to be like, oh, let's go have sex because I need more physical touch today. And so it's recognizing it's more than just physical touch. It's a quality time. It can be all of whatever you need love in. It can cover all of those. And learning to just say yes instead of no because it's a to-do list often shifts their mentality and perspective of it into I get to instead of I have to. And so that's kind of the goal right off the bat, is to encourage a yes unless there's trauma, there's other issues. So I can't, like, it is not a blanket statement. I won't tell every woman, just go have sex with your husband. Just do it twice a week. Because there's a whole list of reasons why they're not wanting it. And if there was trauma, if there was abuse, if there was any of these things that it continues to come up with it, sometimes we need to work through some of those and potentially bring the husband in to talk through, okay, what's the game plan? How do we do this so it meets both of your needs? Because we don't want the husband going without. And so it's learning to ask the questions where they're both at and what they both want, because ultimately they want to have a loving, healthy sex life.
What can we learn about ourselves through how we're showing up in sex?
That's a good question.
Oh, that is a good question. Now I need a minute.
Okay, yeah, take your time.
Can I tell you a quick thing? It won't be the
Jer,
authority on it, but my experience when you say that, even through what you were just talking about a bit ago, Rebekah, is I was surprised at how uncomfortable I actually was with emotional intimacy in my marriage. Shockingly surprised, especially given, my day job for the last 6-7 years of traveling around teaching workshops on vulnerability and connection and communication and all these things. And then how daunting it was to ask for things in sexual intimacy, which is hugely vulnerable, to have needs, all those things. So one thing I learned about myself was I was a bit of an intimacy orphan, kind of like, I don't need to have any needs. I sort of like, and I'm so afraid that if I ask for something, especially in the bedroom, which just equates vulnerability, nakedness, openness, not protected, if I ask for it there, especially as a man, this kind of basic need, and it doesn't get met, I don't know how I'll cope with that. I don't know how I kind of walk myself through that. So that's one way I think I realized I was showing up or not showing up.
We take it as a value statement of us if the request is denied. And so it's an exposure. Totally. We show up in the bedroom and expose ourselves to potentially be destroyed. And to put ourselves out there, hey, would you do this for me or this? And it is extremely vulnerable, because if you're a person that doesn't have needs, to have one of the deepest, most intimate needs, it puts you on unsteady ground. Mm-hmm. This is part of what we do. I help with quite a few women on, because they don't know what they want, because they've never been educated. They've never been given an opportunity to ask, because they don't know what to ask for, but they just know they want more, but not knowing what is more, which kind of goes back to Kirk's comment. You had a functional fine sex life until you learned there was something more.
So to sort of rectify, or at least moving forward, what would your hope be that the conversation around sex looks like or becomes? Is it just purely more, or is it more in a context of something? You know, we just need to be talking about it more. Or it's weird because sex is everywhere. It's monetized, it's proselytized, it's sensualized, and it's blared at you in some ways, but it's not real conversation about sex. It's more like just appealing to a sort of base need and something. So is it just more talk, or is it more talk like
I would
what?
say more talk to get people comfortable. And so when I started, people would ask why I was doing it and what's my goal. And my goal, I would say, is to bridge the gap between the sacredness of Christianity sex and the fun of secular sex, and merge them together, and to just bridge that gap so that people see it as the gift that it is and sacred, but it's not taboo and it's not off limits.
I think to do that, you have to teach Christians it's sacred.
Exactly. It's true.
Right? I mean, I know what you mean. When you said that, I'm like,
interesting.
Yeah, I get that. But my experience in the Christian context was like, it took me till I was 40 to find out it was sacred.
It's interesting. You're right. It's like the taboo-ness, or it hasn't been clearly identified as don't do it because it's sacred. It's don't do it because it's bad or you're bad,
or something bad will happen.
Becomes bad and shameful. Yeah. So something bad will happen, instead of it's divinely beyond what we really understand about it. Therefore, treat it with a lot of care, not flippantly. What's sacred? I mean, so it sounds like more conversation with value for it.
And I would also say education, like Kirk just said, like you have to be taught what it is. And so learning more, instead of, just the birds and the bees, like actually have conversations with backing, with information, the whys, the what fors, this is how your body works, and it is good.
This is an unfiltered, unprocessed thought. But when I hear people play with this idea, I'm always attracted by it, but I don't know what to do with it or where to take it, or I don't have any recommendations out of this at all. But one of the thinkers that I follow will talk about how he talks a lot about taboos. And if you want to make something highly desirable, turn it into a taboo. The thing to make sure that it happens is to make it a taboo. And so then he goes, if you want your 16-year-old or 14-year-old daughter to have sex, for sure, give her a purity ring. I mean, that's all it takes. And
Oh my gosh.
He'll play with this purity culture as being the thing that creates the taboo, which makes it happen. And then there's a TED Talk out who I can't remember who did it. It's about 3 or 4 years ago. And he talks about how purity cultures form. Various cultures will have this idea embedded in it. It's part of being human. We want to understand what clean is. But right now we have it around food. We literally talk about clean eating. And his argument is that the vegetarian and then into the vegan movements are purity movements. And the same thing is happening inside of environmentalism. And there's this value shaming that goes on around a purity culture, around how you're choosing to show up in the world as it relates to the environment, or whatever cause you're after will form a purity culture. And then you can be shamed out of or be brought into based on how you're behaving and what all this stuff. And there's a code. His argument is that in the Christian world, that's around sex. And it's a way of knowing who's in and who's out and who's good and who's bad. Then it becomes a way of belonging and all that. And when I listen to all that from that perspective, well, that's a terrible thing to do to sex, to make it a mechanism through which we know who's unclean. I'm like, oh, that's not what sex is for. It feels like that's what it's been turned into. If you unwind that and you don't make, if you decouple sex from purity, then like I've never lived in that world. I don't know what that would look like. And then how do you teach what healthy sexuality even is? That idea, it makes me very aware how wrapped up into that culture I have always been. And I can't think outside of it at this point on that subject. I think it's an area where I am still underdeveloped. I'm just baffled by that, because I wouldn't have said I was underdeveloped. I would have said I'm fine.
It reminds me of in the movie Inception, when they're trying to implant the idea into the heir's mind that's going to help him, do what he needs to do to, not create the global monopoly. And one of the guys, he suggests an idea, and it's a negative idea to scare him into doing the right thing. And they go, no. A positive idea is always a stronger motivator than an avoidance of a negative. And to me, I guess the inherent question is like, what's the positive? Where did the positive go of the sacredness of sex versus, I think all of us who grew up in a Christian culture could be like, well, it wasn't even a good negative either. So if like, don't do it, well, why not? Maybe get someone pregnant. Okay, well, there's ways around that. Maybe you have a disease. Well, there's ways around. What is negative wasn't even that good, but what's the really beautiful positive there? And that one does require a bit of work.
I get to the edge of this conversation and I'm just like, I don't actually know. I don't know.
We talked about kind of myths in the beginning that I think people believe, which are the converse of some of this positive we're trying to talk about. I'm curious actually to divide it between men and women. What would unless it's just across the board, if there's specifics for each sex, what would your kind of hope be for them if you could distill, like, so you're sort of like, this is what felt like an awesome, successful coaching relationship. We got to this point.
More often than not, it's a desire issue is why people come to see me. I don't desire my wife. I don't desire my husband, whatever. And so figuring out what and when the desire left and why you chose to let it go. Because a lot of it is a choice. Having a fun, thriving sex life takes a lot of intentionality. It doesn't just happen, because in a busy world that we all live in, you can go and be like, oh, hey, there you are 2 weeks later. And you realize, oh, no, I actually, if I want to keep that connection, the more you have it, the more you want it. Allowing yourself to think outside of the box, to give yourself a little extra time, to be confident in it, and remember that you're on the same team. Because a lot of times it's the husband against the wife and the wife against the husband. She doesn't want it, he doesn't want it. And you become opponents instead of teammates. And if you can remember that you're actually teammates and you're going for the same goal, then you take out the competitive part which makes asking a lot easier in the bedroom. Because rarely do we want to ask an opponent for something vulnerable. And so if you can go into the bedroom or wherever it is, it doesn't have to be the bedroom, just throwing it out there. If you can ask them and remember that you're on the same team, that you thriving means I'm going to thrive. It shifts their perspective and it gives them hope that they can get somewhere.
A great sex life doesn't just happen. It takes intentionality. Was like worth the price of admission. I would say I know that, but I don't think I've been realizing how much the opposite is reinforced just through every way that sex is talked about and shown and expressed. There's something balancing about that and almost refreshing in a way. Because I think a lot of the shame comes with like, oh, you mean my hormones didn't just carry me through 60 years of marriage or 30 years or whatever, you know, I mean, like just my inherent erotic desire didn't just get me this great hot sex life. It's like, why would you think that? Well, I don't know, because everyone's saying that's the way it should be.
So, Jer, let's, it's funny on this subject, normally I go for a question and it just falls out of me. It's easy. And this one I'm like, I don't know what I'm talking about. So revealing. I'm going to ask Jer a question. No, I'm not. No, I'm going to crawl back in my shell. Here's what I'm thinking of. As we've been talking about this last hour with Becca, what are your takeaways? What are you hearing?
Initially, my knee jerk is that I feel a lot of freedom in someone overtly saying, that's okay. That's great. No, keep trying. Like this sort of just like this, it feels like tense. Like sex feels the talk around sex, the like, what's healthy, what's good, it should be, all this stuff. And so the freedom of, man, it's a process. It's nuanced. It's like, there is no, you've achieved, you've arrived, you're successful, you're not kind of thing. Feels like a huge, that feels great. One of my so that's a big feeling takeaway, which is give yourself a break. Intentionality is necessary to have a great sex life. And that intentionality is so far reaching. Like you said, you start out saying I'm an emotional, relational, what were they? And sexual coach. Yeah. So, and also was the fact that it's sort of difficult to really describe. It's sort of like this moving, nebulous, sort of like it has its own life, says more about it than what we can actually concretely describe, and to sort of honor that.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you describe what this sacred thing is? Well, let's sit down and talk over 6 months for an hour a week. It sort of brings it back into its sacredness. So in a long-winded response, those are my takeaways.
What you just said is what I tell most of my clients day one, that it is a marathon, not a sprint. It's enjoying the process, because we don't want to just arrive. And so it's the process of learning and exploring yourself and each other. It's a fluid conversation. You don't box yourself or each other in. It's you just kind of roll and see where it takes you.
If someone were to listen to this podcast and think, oh my gosh, I didn't even know I needed a sex coach, or that there was one here in Reading, how could they get a hold of you?
Email's the best way. It is Rebekah, rebekah.pdc@gmail.com.
Thanks, Rebekah, for coming on, sharing your story with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Showing Up. If you'd like to connect with Kirk and Jer and what they're working on, you can do it at jeremybyrne.com or at kirkwayman.com. You can also check out more episodes of the Showing Up podcast at showinguppodcast.com.